black granite, 60 meters above the Pacific. A lighthouse with its top sheared off by lightning a lifetime ago, leaning toward a cliff that has been falling into the sea for 90 years. The wind moves through 100 broken panes of glass like a voice that has been waiting too long to speak. Below the cliff, the tide comes in. Above the cliff, a black Mercedes pulls up to a wrought iron gate. A driver in leather gloves opens the rear door. A black silk heel touches wet gravel. A diamond bracelet catches the gray morning light. A woman in cream cashmere does not look at the tower. She does not need to. She has already decided what to do with it. 200 meters away, parked on the shoulder, a battered Subaru. Behind the wheel, a girl in a thin denim jacket, 19 years old. $200 to her name. Inside the lighthouse, something her father buried 20 years ago is beginning to stir. They thought they had buried her father along with everything he had ever owned. They thought the 19-year-old girl standing in the rain had walked away with nothing but a crumbling lighthouse on a cliff that was falling into the sea. They were wrong about the lighthouse. They were wrong about the girl. And they were wrong about the woman in the cream cashmere coat who could not even pretend to weep at the grave. The rain came down sideways that morning in Astoria. Not the soft Oregon mist Marigold Hollister had grown up with. Not the kind that kissed your jacket and left silver beads on your eyelashes. This rain was cruel, cold, the kind that bites through wool and finds bone. She stood at the edge of the open grave, her boots sinking into the mud, her father's mahogany casket lowering inch by inch into a hole she could not believe was real. She was 19 years old, and she was now completely alone. The minister kept talking, something about ashes, something about returning. Marigold heard none of it. Her ears were full of static. Her hands were full of a tissue she had shredded into ribbons. Her chest was full of something heavier than rain. Across the grave stood her stepmother, Yvonne Caldwell, 48, tall, slender, wearing a black designer coat that probably cost more than 3 months of Marigold's rent, a black silk scarf, a black hat with a small veil pinned to it like she was attending a funeral in a Hitchcock film. Her assistant held a massive umbrella over her head. Not one drop of rain touched Yvonne's perfectly contoured cheekbones. She was dabbing her eyes. Her eyes were dry. Marigold watched her stepmother dab those dry eyes with a black handkerchief that had been steam-pressed that morning, and something cold uncoiled in her chest, something that had been sleeping for 3 years. Beside Yvonne stood Sterling, her son, 24, scrolling on his phone, wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit, looking bored, looking like he was waiting for the dentist. He glanced up once, caught Marigold's eye. He smirked. She felt the smirk like a slap. Because Marigold remembered. She remembered everything. She remembered her father teaching her how to refinish a walnut sideboard when she was 8. The way he held her hands over the steel wool. The way he said, "Patience, Marie. The wood remembers everything that ever happened to it. We just have to listen." She remembered her father at her mother's funeral 12 years ago. How he had not cried. How he had held her tiny hands so tightly her knuckles ached. How he had whispered, "We're going to be okay, you and me. We're a team now." A team. And now her team was a wooden box sinking into Oregon mud. The minister finished. People began to drift away. Black umbrellas like a flock of strange birds taking flight. Yvonne let her assistant guide her toward the waiting black Mercedes. She did not look at Marigold. She did not say a word. She passed within 3 feet of her stepdaughter and acted like Marigold was a stranger she had never met. Sterling did look. He paused. He winked. He winked. At a funeral. At his stepsister. Marigold felt her hands curl into fists inside her thin cotton gloves. She felt her breath catch. She felt 12 years of grief and 3 years of helplessness and 1 week of disbelief all rise up at once. And she did nothing. Because what could she do? She had no money. She had no power. She had no one. She stood in the rain until the cemetery workers came with their shovels. Until they began to fill the grave with dirt. until each thud of wet earth on her father's coffin became a sound she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. She finally turned and walked back to her Subaru, the 2009 model, the one with the rust on the rear wheel well, the one her father had bought her for her 16th birthday with a red ribbon tied around the hood. She sat in the driver's seat. She did not start the engine. She put her forehead against the steering wheel, and she made a sound that was not quite a sob. It was something older than a sob, something animal, something a girl makes when she realizes the last person in the world who loved her unconditionally is gone. 2 days later, Marigold sat in the law office of Bartholomew Finch. The office smelled like leather and lemon polish and old paper, mahogany shelves, brass lamps, a grandfather clock in the corner that ticked too loudly. Bartholomew Finch was 73, white hair, reading glasses balanced on the tip of his nose. He had been her father's attorney for 31 years. He had also been her father's friend. Marigold could see it in his face, the pity, the discomfort, the way his eyes kept skipping over her like she was something he did not want to look at directly. That was when she knew. Whatever this was, it was going to be bad. Yvonne sat across the polished conference table. She had changed out of morning black. Now she wore cream cashmere and a single strand of pearls. She looked like she was about to host a luncheon at the country club. She was checking her watch. A Cartier, diamond bezel, sterling slouched beside her, chewing gum, loudly. "Can we please get on with this, Bartholomew?" Yvonne's voice was light, pleasant, like she was asking for sugar in her tea. "I have a showing in Lake Oswego at 3, the Wellington Estate, very particular buyers." Bartholomew Finch cleared his throat. He looked at Marigold. He looked away. Very well. He opened the heavy leather binder on his desk. He began to read. Marigold heard the words, but they were not words. They were stones being dropped into deep water. Each one made her sink further down. The lakefront estate at Oswego Point. To Yvonne. The Hollister Antique storefront on Northwest 23rd Avenue. To Yvonne. The 17th century French clock collection. To Yvonne. The investment portfolio managed by Pacific Crest Wealth. To Yvonne. The vintage Mercedes 280 SL. To Yvonne. The art collection. To Yvonne. The jewelry. To Yvonne. The cash holdings. To Yvonne. $11 million, sliding away like water through cupped fingers, sliding into the lap of a woman who could not even pretend to weep at the grave. Marigold sat very still. She thought of her mother's diamond pendant, the 6-carat one that had belonged to her grandmother, the one her mother had worn every single day of her life. Yvonne had it now. Yvonne was probably going to sell it. "To my biological daughter," Bartholomew Finch read. His voice cracked slightly. "Marigold Eleanor Hollister." She held her breath. "I leave the property known as the Ravenscar Light Station, located on Cape Disappointment in Pacific County on the Oregon side of the Columbia River mouth, including the lighthouse structure, the keeper's cottage, and the 4 acres of cliffside land surrounding said structures, free and clear of all encumbrances." Silence. Marigold blinked. "That's it." Her voice came out as a whisper. "He left me a lighthouse." Yvonne laughed. It was a delicate laugh, a practiced laugh. The laugh women in cream cashmere have rehearsed for 30 years to deploy at exactly these moments. "Oh, sweetheart." Yvonne shook her head. "Your father always said you were the artistic one, the dreamer, the one who needed something picturesque." She said the word picturesque like it was a slur. "Ravenscar," Sterling snorted. "Isn't that the one they're trying to demolish?" "Condemned," Yvonne sighed. 6 years on the state's structural hazard list. Last keeper died there in 1943. Nobody's lit that lamp in over 80 years. The cliffs eroding underneath it. 3 more winters, and it'll fall into the Pacific. She turned a sweet smile on Marigold. Consider it sentimental, dear. Your father knew you loved old things. Marigold's mouth was dry. Bartholomew. Her voice was small. When was this will written? He hesitated. 4 months ago. 4 months. 4 months ago, her father had been so deep in the fog of Parkinson's medication that he could no longer remember her birthday. 4 months ago, she had not been allowed inside the lakefront house. 4 months ago, she had been driving past her childhood home at midnight just to see if his bedroom light was on. 4 months ago, Yvonne had told her on the phone, "He doesn't want to see you, Marigold. He says you upset him. The doctor says no visitors for his own good." He had Parkinson's. Marigold heard her own voice rising. He was on 3 different medications. He could not have. He would not have. He was lucid. Yvonne's voice flattened, hardened. 3 independent neurologists signed off on his cognitive capacity that day. Their depositions are in the file. He knew exactly what he was doing. She slid a piece of paper across the polished mahogany. "Sign this." Marigold looked down, a waiver, a document relinquishing her right to contest the will, to never sue, to never speak. "I will be generous, Marigold." Yvonne's voice was suddenly soft, almost kind, the way a cat is kind to a mouse. "There are back taxes on the Ravenscar property, 9 years of unpaid county assessments, roughly $14,000. If you sign this, the estate will absorb those taxes. If you do not sign, I will be forced to liquidate the lighthouse to recover administrative costs. And you will walk away with nothing." The grandfather clock ticked. Marigold looked at Bartholomew. He met her eyes. He shook his head, almost imperceptibly, almost like he was warning her. But he did not speak. He could not speak. Marigold thought of her bank account. $642. She thought of her rent. Past due. She thought of the eviction notice taped to her apartment door. She thought of the cost of a lawyer to fight Yvonne. The retainer alone would be $10,000. Minimum. And Yvonne had teams. Yvonne had Pacific Crest Wealth on retainer. Yvonne had 3 neurologists already lined up. Yvonne would bury her in motions and continuances until Marigold was sleeping in her Subaru. She thought of the lighthouse. The lighthouse her father had paid taxes on for 20 years without ever telling her about it. The lighthouse that did not exist in any conversation she had ever had with him. The lighthouse that had been sitting on Cape Disappointment her whole life like a secret he was keeping. Why had he kept it? Why had he left it to her now? Her hand reached for the pen. The pen was a Mont Blanc. Silver. Heavy. She signed her name. A single tear escaped her eye. It landed on the document, right next to her signature. It blurred the H in Hollister into something soft and shapeless. Yvonne snatched the paper back. Smart girl. She stood. She smoothed her trousers. She picked up her Hermes handbag. "Have fun in the salt air, Marigold. Try not to fall off the cliff." Sterling laughed. He laughed all the way out the door. The sound followed Marigold like a wasp she could not swat. Bartholomew Finch stayed in his chair. When the door closed, he reached across the desk. He covered her small hand with his old wrinkled one. "Marigold." She could not look at him. "Marigold, listen to me. Your father, he was many things, but he was not a fool." "Bartholomew." Her voice broke. "He just gave her everything. He gave her my mother's pendant. He gave her the antique shop. He gave her. Marigold." Bartholomew squeezed her hand. "Go to the lighthouse." She looked up. "What?" "Go to the lighthouse." His old blue eyes were burning with something. Something he could not say. Something he was forbidden to say. The kind of thing an attorney knows but cannot tell. "Why?" "Just," he pressed his lips together, "just go, and look, and listen, and Marigold." Yes. Trust your father. He pulled his hand back. He straightened the binder. He looked away. She understood that the conversation was over. She left the office in a fog. 2 weeks passed. They passed like a fever dream. She tried to find a new apartment. Every landlord she called wanted first month, last month's security deposit. $8,000 before she could even unpack a single box. She did not have $8,000. She did not have $800. She had $642, and now she had $411 because she had needed groceries and gas and a black dress to wear to the lawyer's office. She tried to find a roommate. Every listing on every Portland College board wanted background checks she could not afford and references she could not produce. She had been a freelance illustrator for 2 years. She had been mostly supported by her father's monthly transfers. Transfers that had stopped 6 months ago when Yvonne took over his banking. She had nothing. She had a Subaru. She had a Lighthouse. On a Tuesday in late October, she packed her life into the back of the Subaru. A suitcase of clothes, a box of books, her father's leather toolkit, her mother's old quilt, 3 boxes of art supplies, a tent, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, a propane heater, a box of canned soup, a flashlight, 2 blankets, a pillow. She closed the trunk. She sat in the driver's seat. She looked at her apartment building for the last time, the one she had moved into the week she had started community college, the one her father had helped her carry the futon up 3 flights of stairs to, the one where she had spent her 18th birthday eating Thai food on the floor with her dad because the kitchen table had not been delivered yet. She put the car in drive. She left Portland. The road to Cape Disappointment took 3 hours. Down through Astoria, across the Astoria-Megler Bridge, into Washington State and back into the wild edge of the Pacific Northwest. She passed pine forests so dense they swallowed the daylight. She passed fields of late autumn wheat going gold. She passed roadside stands selling pumpkins. She passed a herd of elk standing in a meadow looking at her like she was crossing into a country they ruled. The radio kept losing signal. She turned it off. She drove the last 20 miles in silence. The Cape Disappointment headland rose up out of the coast like the prow of an enormous gray ship. Sheer granite cliffs, 60 meters straight down to a churning Pacific. Black volcanic rock at the waterline being smashed by waves that had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean before they got there. And on the cliff, at the very edge, stood the lighthouse. Marigold pulled over on the gravel shoulder. She got out of the car. The wind hit her face like a slap. She stared. Ravenscar Light. The photographs in the will papers had not done it justice. The photographs had been small, faded, bureaucratic. This was a monument. The tower was made of granite, not gray granite, black granite, quarried from the dark heart of the Cascade Range 140 years ago and hauled down to the coast by oxen barge. Almost 30 meters tall, round at the base, tapering upward, the original copper roof long gone. The top of the tower was sheared off at an angle, jagged, lightning-struck, like a tooth broken in half during a fistfight. The windows were tall and narrow, most of them empty, glass long since shattered. The ones that still held panes were greenish, salt-fogged, cataract-blind. Ivy crawled up the lower half of the tower like a green disease. Sea moss, lichen the color of old bones, streaks of orange where iron fittings had bled rust down the stone for a century. A wrought iron weather vane on the broken roof spun slowly in the Pacific wind. It made a sound like a knife being sharpened. Beside the tower stood the keeper's cottage, or what was left of it. Single story, stone walls, wooden roof half collapsed. One window still had a faded blue curtain visible through the broken glass. And around all of it, a low stone wall, a maze of low stone walls actually, knee-high, crisscrossing the property in patterns Marigold could not understand. They led nowhere in particular. They formed no enclosure. They just existed. like someone had built a labyrinth and then changed their mind halfway through. Beyond the lighthouse, beyond the cliff edge, nothing. Just the gray, endless Pacific. Marigold stood in the wind, her hair whipping across her face, her thin denim jacket no match for the cold, salt air. And she felt something she did not expect. She felt small, but not the small that crushes you, the small that wakes you up, because something this large, this old, this ruined and beautiful at the same time, could not be an accident. Her father had not just inherited this, forgotten it, stuck her with it as a parting joke. Her father had been a man who restored things, a man who saw what something had been and worked patiently to bring it back. And he had paid taxes on this lighthouse for 20 years, quietly, without ever telling his daughter. She got back in the car. She drove the last quarter mile down a gravel road choked with blackberry brambles. She parked beside the keeper's cottage. She got out. A voice spoke behind her. "You must be the Hollister girl." Marigold spun around. The woman was small, maybe 5 feet tall. She wore a yellow rain slicker that looked older than Marigold was, gray hair and a long braid down her back, skin like a leather map of every winter she had ever seen, eyes the color of pale tea, maybe 75, maybe 80, hard to tell. She was holding a thermos in two enamel mugs. "I," Marigold's voice cracked. "Yes, I'm Marigold Hollister." "Henrietta Doyle." The old woman nodded once. "I live in the gray cottage about 3/4 of a mile back up the road. The one with the blue shutters. Saw your car go past." She held out the thermos. "Coffee." Marigold accepted it, mostly because she did not know how to refuse a thermos from a stranger in the middle of nowhere. Henrietta poured. Marigold sipped. It was strong, almost bitter, with cardamom in it, the way her grandmother used to make it. "Thank you." Henrietta studied her over the rim of her own mug. "You look like him." Marigold went still. "You knew my father." "I knew your father." Henrietta nodded once. "I knew him for 21 years, ever since he started coming out here to look after the tower." Marigold could not breathe. "He, once a month, sometimes twice. He'd drive up, he'd walk around the property. Sometimes he'd be here for a few hours, sometimes for 2 days. I'd see his truck. We'd wave." "Why?" Henrietta looked up at the broken tower. "That is a question I have asked myself for 2 decades. I never had the courage to ask him." "He," Marigold could not finish the sentence. She could not finish any sentence. "He paid the property taxes on this place for 20 years, Marigold, out of his own pocket, to the county assessor's office. Personally, I know because I was the previous owner." Marigold turned slowly. "You." "My family owned this lighthouse from 1936 until 1998. My grandfather bought it from the federal government after they decommissioned it. Then my husband inherited it. Then my husband died. I couldn't keep up with the taxes. I couldn't afford the cliff stabilization assessments. I was going to lose it. To the state. They were going to demolish it for the salvage stone." She paused. "And then a man knocked on my door. He said he had heard the property was about to be condemned. He said he would buy it for whatever I owed and back taxes, plus $1. And he asked if I would tell anyone." Henrietta's eyes met Marigold's. "I said no." "Why did he?" "I don't know, child." "You don't." "He came back every month for 20 years. He never explained. He just nodded at me. And he walked into that tower. And he stayed for hours, sometimes overnight, with a flashlight and a notebook. And once, with a man in a hard hat I did not recognize. They surveyed something for a whole afternoon." Marigold's hands were shaking. The coffee mug rattled. Henrietta took it from her gently. "I think your father loved this place." "Why?" That is also a question you will have to answer for yourself. The old woman tucked the thermos under her arm. She walked toward the gravel path. Then she paused. She turned back. Marigold. Yes. Locals call it the Lighthouse of the Drowned. What? Three keepers died here in the 30s. Different years, different ways. One drowned at low tide. One fell from the tower. One. Henrietta paused. One was found inside, with a key in his hand. Nobody ever figured out what the key opened. Marigold's mouth went dry. Good night, Hollister girl. Henrietta Doyle walked away down the gravel path. Marigold stood alone in the wind. She slept that night in the keeper's cottage, or tried to. She had set up her tent inside the one room with a roof that still held. The wind came through the broken windows like an animal moving in the dark. She had brought a kerosene lantern. She kept it burning low. She lay on her sleeping bag with her mother's quilt pulled up to her chin. She listened. The lighthouse groaned. Stone does not creak. Stone moans, low, long, as if remembering something. She could hear the Pacific eating the cliff 60 meters below. She did not sleep. She thought about her father. She thought about how he had spent 20 years driving out here, to stand inside a broken tower, to take notes, to bring a man in a hard hat, to pay taxes on stone and ghosts. She thought about how he had never once mentioned it. Not at dinner, not on long drives, not at her birthday, not when she was little and obsessed with lighthouses and made him buy her a coloring book with 18 famous American beacons in it. Not once he had kept this. From her, for her. The next morning she began to clean. The keeper's cottage came first. She wore her father's old leather work gloves. She wore a bandana over her mouth. She swept. She hauled out rotted curtains. She pulled up a moldy rug and dragged it outside. She found a nest of mice in an old wood stove and used a broom to coax them out into the brambles. She found broken bottles, a child's tin truck rusted into a single solid lump, a 1947 calendar from a feed store in Owako, a photograph in a cracked frame, a man and a woman in front of the lighthouse. The man wore a keeper's uniform. The woman wore a long dark dress. They were both smiling. The back of the frame said, Albert and June, October 1938. The Lighthouse of the Drowned. She cleaned for 3 days. On the 4th day, she opened the trunk she had brought from her apartment, the one her father had given her in his final lucid month. He had handed it to her in the parking lot of his physical therapy clinic. She had thought it was full of old photographs. She had not opened it. She had not been able to. The grief had been too fresh. She knelt on the cottage floor now. Lantern light, cold morning, salt wind through the broken windows. She lifted the lid. The trunk smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco. It contained a wedding photograph of her parents, Eleanor in a simple white dress, Edmund in a brown suit too big for him, both laughing, a child's drawing, crayon, 3 stick figures, Mom, Dad, me, Marigold's 8th grade graduation cap, a small velvet pouch, a pillow. A small needlepoint pillow she remembered, from her father's reading chair, embroidered with a sailing ship. She had teased him about that pillow her whole life because it did not match anything in the house. She picked up the pillow. It was heavier than it should have been. She turned it over. The seam at the back had been open and neatly sewn shut, recently, with thread that was a slightly different shade of cream than the original. Her heart stopped. She used her teeth to pull a stitch. She tugged. The seam opened. Inside the pillow, a brass key, old, heavy, about 4 inches long, something serious. The bow of the key was shaped like an anchor. The shaft was crusted with the green patina of decades, and a folded piece of paper. Marigold unfolded it with hands that trembled like aspen leaves. 3 lines, in her father's handwriting, his handwriting from before the Parkinsons. Strong, steady, The way he used to sign her permission slips in middle school. Seventh floor. Count backwards. Trust no one but the woman in the yellow coat. Marigold sat back on her heels. The yellow coat. She thought of Henrietta Doyle in her ancient yellow rain slicker. The seventh floor. She thought of the lighthouse outside her window. 6 floors. She had counted them yesterday. She had walked around the whole tower. She had counted the windows. The lighthouse was 6 floors. The keeper's quarters at the base. 4 service floors above. The lantern room at the top. 6. 6 floors, not 7. Marigold stood up so fast she knocked the lantern. The flame guttered. The light leapt against the cottage walls. She caught the lantern. She steadied it. She picked up the key. She slipped it into the pocket of her jacket. She walked outside. The morning was gray. The wind was steady. The Pacific was the color of pewter. The lighthouse stood 30 meters away. Black granite, broken-toothed, patient, waiting. She crossed the gravel path. She climbed 3 crumbling stone steps to the heavy wooden door at the base of the tower. The door was oak, iron-banded, older than her grandfather. The lock was rusted. The hinges had not turned in decades. She put her shoulder against it. She pushed. It groaned. It resisted. She pushed harder. It opened. Cold air rushed out at her. Air that smelled like salt and stone and old machine oil and something else. Something faint. Something that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. It smelled like paper, like very old paper, stored carefully, somewhere out of the rain, for a very long time. Marigold stood in the doorway. The wind off the Pacific pushed at her back like a hand telling her, "Go. Go in. Go in now." She thought of her father, 20 years of monthly visits, a man in a hard hat, a surveyor, a flashlight, a notebook. She thought of her mother, a diary in a box that she had not yet found the courage to open. She thought of Yvonne, diamond watch, stepping over Marigold's life like Marigold was a stain on the carpet. She thought of Henrietta, the woman in the yellow coat, whose family had owned this tower for 62 years and never figured out what was inside. She thought of the key in her pocket, 7th floor, count backwards. She took one step, then another, then she was inside the lighthouse. The interior was hollow, cold, cathedral still. A spiral staircase of black iron rose up the inner wall of the tower, round and round, up into shadow, up into the lantern room 60 feet above. Each iron tread was eaten with rust. Each tread groaned softly under her boots, like it had been waiting 100 years to be walked on again. She climbed. 1 floor, a small landing, an iron door that had rusted half off its hinges. She peered through. An empty stone room, a wooden chair, a broken oil can. Nothing. 2 floors, another landing, another iron door. This one had a window. She could see through to another empty room. Stone walls weeping with damp. 3 floors, 4, 5. Each landing told her the same story. Empty, abandoned. Stone and rust and salt water and silence. 6 floors, the lantern room. She stepped out onto the highest landing and the wind hit her through 100 broken panes of glass. The lantern room was a circle of iron framework and shattered windows looking out in every direction. The light itself was still there. The first-order Fresnel lens, 8 feet tall, a masterpiece of cut glass prisms made in Paris in 1887 and shipped around Cape Horn to reach this coast. It had not turned in 83 years. It was choked with dust, with cobwebs, with one dead seagull. But it was still beautiful, even broken, even silent, even drowned in dust. The Fresnel lens was 1,000 glass teeth in a mouth that had once swallowed darkness and spat out light. Marigold walked around the lantern room. She looked down at her feet. Nothing. She looked up. Nothing. This was the top of the tower. There was no seventh floor. She turned in a slow circle. The wind tore at her hair. The Pacific lay below her in every direction. The mainland to the east, the endless gray water to the west. 6. She had counted 6. She had walked 6. There was no seventh. She pulled the note out of her pocket. She read it again. The words had not changed. Seventh floor. Count backwards. Count backwards. She froze. She looked down. She looked at the iron staircase below her feet. She had counted up. What if her father had not meant counting up? What if her father had meant counting down? Down. From the lantern room. What if the seventh floor was not above the sixth? What if the seventh floor was below the first? Marigold turned. She raced back down the iron staircase, floor by floor, her boots clanging like a bell tolling. 6 floors, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The ground floor of the lighthouse, the keeper's foyer, where she had begun her climb. She stopped on the stone floor. She looked around the round chamber. Stone walls, iron staircase rising, a small workbench against one wall, a coil of moldy rope, a wooden box, a rusted oil can, a wooden hatch in the floor that she had assumed was a sealed bilge access, a wooden hatch in the floor. She had walked over it on her way up the stairs. She had not seen it, because a moth-eaten woolen rug had been draped over it, a dark green wool that blended in with the shadows. The rug had been there so long it looked like part of the floor, but it was not part of the floor. Marigold knelt down. She gripped the corner of the rug. She pulled. A cloud of dust rose into the lantern light. She coughed. She waved the dust away. She blinked. Underneath, a wooden hatch, oak, iron hinged, set flush into the stone floor, a heavy iron ring sunk into the wood. In the center of the hatch, below the iron ring, a keyhole, shaped like an anchor. Marigold's hand went to her pocket. She pulled out the brass key. The bow of the key was an anchor. She knelt. She slid the key into the lock. It went in. She turned for a moment. Nothing. Then, a deep mechanical click that vibrated up through her knees. Tumblers that had been waiting decades for the right hand. The hatch shifted. A breath of cold air rose from the seam. Air that did not smell like salt or stone or seagulls. Air that smelled like old paper, like leather bindings, like brass instruments, like machine oil, like the inside of a museum nobody had visited in 100 years. Marigold gripped the iron ring with both hands. She braced her legs. She pulled. The hatch did not want to open. It resisted her like the lighthouse itself was holding its breath. She pulled harder. Her arms burned. Her back ached. She heard her own breath rasping in her ears. She pulled. The hatch gave way. It flipped back on its hinges with a heavy wooden thump. Marigold knelt at the edge of a square black hole in the floor of the lighthouse. She looked down. Stone steps, cut directly into the granite of the cliff itself, spiraling downward, polished smooth by many feet over many years, disappearing into a darkness that did not feel like the bottom of a basement. It felt like the bottom of the world. She fumbled in her pocket for her flashlight. She clicked it on. She pointed the beam down. The light traveled. Down, down, down. It found nothing but more stone steps. The shaft went deeper than the height of the lighthouse above it, maybe 20 meters, maybe more. She thought of her father, walking down these steps once a month, for 20 years, alone, knowing what was below, saying nothing. She thought of Cordelia, a name on her family tree she had heard exactly twice in her life. Her father's grandmother, a woman her father's mother had refused to discuss, a woman whose photograph had been removed from every family album. She thought of her own mother, whose voice she could no longer perfectly remember, whose face in her dreams had begun to soften like a photograph left in the sun. She thought of the note, 7th floor, Count backwards. Trust no one but the woman in the yellow coat. Marigold sat at the edge of the black hole in the lighthouse floor. She held the flashlight in one trembling hand. She held the brass anchor key in the other. The wind from the Pacific moved through the broken windows above her like a chorus of voices saying something she could not quite hear. She took a deep breath. She placed her foot on the first stone step, and she began to descend into whatever it was that her father and her great-grandmother and 100 years of women in her family she had never been told about had buried beneath the Ravenscar light. The stone steps were old, older than the lighthouse above her. Marigold understood this within the first 10 steps, because the stone beneath her boots was different. The lighthouse tower was black granite, quarried somewhere, hauled and stacked and mortared. But these steps were carved, directly, out of the living cliff, out of the same gray bedrock the Pacific had been chewing on for 10 million years. Somebody had cut these steps by hand a long time ago, before the lighthouse ever stood here. She descended. The flashlight beam jumped ahead of her. The wind from the broken windows above grew faint, then fainter, then gone, replaced by something else. Silence. A silence with weight. She had read once in a book that the deepest silence on earth is found inside caves, because rock absorbs sound, because there is no surface for an echo to bounce off of, because the rock itself is patient, and patient things are quiet. She kept descending. She counted her steps. Out of some childhood habit, some need to know. 20, 40, 60, 72. The stairs ended. She stood on a flat stone landing about 3 feet wide. In front of her, a wall. Not stone, steel. She raised the flashlight. Her breath stopped. It was a vault door. A real one. Something she had only seen in old gangster movies. Something that belonged to a 1920s bank, not the bottom of a lighthouse on the Pacific coast. Round, reinforced, 6 feet tall, steel forged when American mills still made things meant to outlast the people who installed them. A massive brass wheel sat in the center of the door. A brass combination dial sat beside it. The numbers on the dial had been worn smooth by handling, by many hands, over many years. Marigold's flashlight beam shook. She was 19 years old and standing in a place that should not exist. The bottom of a stair that should not exist. In front of a vault that should not exist. With a key in her pocket that did not fit, because there was no keyhole. There was only the dial. She thought. A combination. She did not know the combination. She would never know the combination. Her father. Her father. Her father would have known. Her father had been down here 100 times. Her father had stood exactly where she was standing. He had spun this dial. He had heard the tumblers click. He had walked through this door. But her father was dead, buried, in Astoria, in Oregon mud. She slid down the wall. She sat on the cold stone landing. She set the flashlight beside her so the beam pointed up at the ceiling. She put her face in her hands. And for a moment, just one moment, she let herself feel how stupid the situation was. She had driven 3 hours and slept 4 nights in a freezing keeper's cottage and climbed up 6 floors of an abandoned tower and back down again to a hidden staircase carved out of a cliff. And now she was sitting in front of a locked vault, like an idiot, like a child in a fairy tale who had followed the breadcrumbs only to find the gingerbread house was a real house with a real lock, and she did not have a real key. She wiped her face. She picked up the flashlight. She panned the beam across the concrete frame around the steel door. And she saw, scratched into the concrete, right above the dial, so small she almost missed it, etched with a nail, or a knife, or something. Decades ago, 6 numbers, 0, 8, 2, 2, 64. She stared. For a long time, she did not understand. Then she did. August 22nd, 1964. She knew that date. She had known that date her whole life. It was her mother's birthday. Her mother, Eleanor Marie Hollister, born August 22nd, 1964, in Cottage Grove, Oregon, to a logger and a schoolteacher, the youngest of four, the only daughter. Dead at age 41 of what her father had always told her was a particularly aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. Marigold stood up. Her hands were not shaking anymore. They were perfectly steady. She reached for the brass dial. She turned it. Right to 8. Click. Left to 22. Click. Right to 64. Click. She held her breath. She grasped the brass wheel. She turned it. The wheel turned smoothly, as if it had been oiled. Recently, within the last few months, the tumblers inside the door retracted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound was deep, mechanical, final. A sound made by people who had cared about things lasting. She pulled. The door swung open. A breath of air rushed out of the vault. Air that did not smell like a tomb. Air that smelled like a museum. Cool, dry, climate-controlled, faintly perfumed with cedar and brass polish and very old paper and something else. Something Marigold did not recognize at first. Then she did. It was lavender. Faint. Old. Lavender stitched into linen sachets and tucked into drawers full of fabric you do not want moths to find. Marigold stepped through the doorway. She fumbled along the wall. She found a pull cord. She tugged. Old porcelain light fixtures flickered, hummed, came to life. One, then another, then another. A whole strand of them snaking off into a long stone corridor. The bulbs were the old kind, carbon filament. They glowed orange amber. They cast everything in the light of a 100-year-old afternoon. Marigold stood in a hallway carved into solid granite. The hallway was perhaps 80 feet long. At the far end, 4 doorways, 2 on each side, each one closed with an oak door bound in iron. Each oak door had a small brass plaque mounted at eye level. Each plaque had been engraved with a single word in elegant copperplate script. The first plaque on her left read, Library. The first plaque on her right read, Assay. The second plaque on her left read, Wireless. The second plaque on her right. Marigold's heart skipped, then started again, slower, quieter. The second plaque on her right read, Eleanor. She walked down the hallway slowly. The amber light glowed against the gray-green granite walls. Her boots made small whispering sounds. She could hear her own breath. She could hear the slow drip of water somewhere very far away. She passed Library. She passed Assay. She passed Wireless. She stopped at Eleanor. She put her hand on the door. She could not open it. Not yet. Not first. Because whatever was inside that room was waiting for her in a way the other rooms were not waiting. And she was not ready. She needed to understand the other rooms first. She needed to understand what kind of place this was. Before she walked into the room with her mother's name on the door, she turned. She walked back. She put her hand on the door marked Library. She pushed. The door opened on silent hinges. She stepped inside. She forgot how to breathe. The room was 40 feet long, maybe more. Vaulted ceiling cut into the bedrock. Walls of shelves carved directly into the granite. The shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, 2 stories tall, with an iron catwalk halfway up. And on every shelf, books, notebooks, leather-bound journals, ledgers, photograph albums, map cases, stacks of newspaper clippings tied with cotton string, The library went on, hundreds of volumes, maybe more than 1,000. In the center of the room, a long oak reading table with a green shaded lamp on it. The lamp was already on. Someone had been here. Recently, in the last 6 months, someone had left a single book open on the table. Marigold approached the table. She looked down. The book was a leather-bound journal. The leather was scuffed, cracked at the spine, leather that had ridden in saddlebags, or pockets, or under floorboards. The pages were thick, hand-pressed paper, faintly yellowed. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, decisive. Handwriting belonging to a woman who had once been taught penmanship by a strict aunt with a ruler. The entry was dated October 14th, 1926. It read, "Tonight we received three. Two were sisters. The younger had a baby. The husband had broken the older sister's jaw last week. The cousin in Astoria had hidden them in a freight cart of canned salmon. They arrived shaking. The baby has croup. I put them in the upper chamber, and I sent for Mrs. Doyle to come from the keeper's cottage. We will board the Annabel Reed in 3 nights when she takes the run up to Victoria. I have already paid the captain. He owes me 4 bottles of the Glenfiddich. He understands his account. May they reach Vancouver before the milk dries. Signed, CHCH. Marigold sat down. The wooden chair was carved oak. It had been pulled out from under the table. Recently. The seat was still warm. No, that was impossible, but the chair felt warm. Maybe she imagined it. She turned the page. Another entry. November 9th, 1926. Sent the Annabel Reed 2 more last night. A girl of 15 running from a stepfather. A woman of 42 whose husband had been beating her for 19 years and who finally took her grandmother's pistol and shot him in the shoulder. He will live. She did not stop to find out. She walked 12 miles in a thunderstorm with 1 canvas bag and a Bible. Mrs. Doyle gave her dry clothes. I gave her $300 in a letter to my friend in Tacoma. Her name is Rose Wells, or rather, her name will be Rose Wells from this morning forward. I have already written the letter. The price of liquor moves in mysterious ways. Tonight, a case of rye whiskey paid for 2 women's lives. I do not regret a single bottle. Signed, C.H. Marigold turned the page. December 2nd, 1926. She turned again. January 18th, 1927. She turned again. April 3rd, 1927. Each entry, names she did not recognize. Women, always running, always being smuggled north or south or east or west on boats that smelled like fish in bootleg Canadian rye. Each entry signed C.H. Marigold stood up. She walked to the shelf nearest the table. The journals on the shelf had small brass tabs at the top of each spine. Dates, the tabs read 1933, 8 years of journals, 8 years of women. Marigold walked along the shelf. She trailed her fingers across the spines. She counted 47 volumes. From October 1926 to December 1933. Hundreds of women. Hundreds. She moved to the next shelf. The tabs continued. 1934, 1935, 1936, 1937. The handwriting on the new tabs was different. Different ink, different hand. A name had been written above the year. The name was Albert Doyle. Marigold remembered the photograph in the cottage. Albert in June, October 1938. Albert had kept the journals going. She moved to the shelf after that. 1938, 1939, 1940. Different handwriting again. June Doyle, Henrietta's mother-in-law. The journals continued. The women continued. The names continued. The journals went all the way to 1973. 47 years of women being smuggled out of the worst situations in the Pacific Northwest. Out of marriages they could not legally leave. Out of houses where the police would not help them. Out of communities that would force them back. The Pacific Northwest in the 1920s had no shelters, no restraining orders, no legal divorce in most states. A woman who ran from a bad marriage was a fugitive. A woman who ran with her children was a kidnapper. But she could not run alone. Someone had to help her. Someone had to know boat schedules, train schedules, safe houses in Vancouver and Tacoma and San Francisco. Someone had to have money and contacts and empty cargo holds and captains who owed favors and a lighthouse on a remote cape that nobody asked questions about. Someone like a rum runner, someone like Cordelia Hollister. Marigold sank to her knees on the granite floor. She was 19 years old. She had grown up thinking her great-grandmother was a name on a family tree and nothing more. Her father had never told her. Her grandmother had never told her. In fact, Marigold suddenly understood. Her grandmother had aggressively never told her. Her grandmother had taken Cordelia's photograph out of every family album. Her grandmother had refused to discuss the woman. Her grandmother had behaved as if Cordelia were a shame, a scandal, something to be erased. Because Cordelia had been a bootlegger. That was the family story. A common low criminal woman who had embarrassed the family by running rum during Prohibition. That was the lie. That was the lie a granddaughter had told her own grandchild. To erase the woman, to erase the work, to erase the names of the women. But Cordelia had not been a bootlegger. Cordelia had been a conductor. The whiskey was the ticket. The women were the cargo. Marigold stood up. She wiped her eyes. She walked back along the shelf to the last journal, the one with the tab marked 1933. She pulled it out. She opened it at random. The final entry of that year was dated December 31st, 1933. The day Prohibition ended. Tomorrow they vote in repeal. The whiskey runs are finished. The cargo holds will be empty in the new year. My friends in Vancouver tell me the captains will not run any more empty trips. There is no profit in saltwater alone. I have 812 names in these books. 812 women I helped to walk away. I do not know how many of them lived. I do not know how many of them found peace. I only know that they walked away when they had been told they could not. I am 61 years old. I will not start another life. I will close the lighthouse. I will send Albert Doyle and June to live in the cottage and watch the road. The chambers will be sealed. The library will sleep. I leave it to whichever Hollister woman comes after me. If she finds it, if she has the wits to look. I have made provision in the deed. The taxes will be paid by my line for as long as there is breath in any of them. The mountain will not be sold. The light will not be lit again until someone in this blood is ready to relight it. I do not know if that will ever happen, but the door will be here, the key will be here, and the names will be here. Signed, Cordelia Hollister. December 31st, 1933. Marigold closed the journal. She held it against her chest. She wept. She wept for a long time. She wept for the women whose names were stacked on these shelves. She wept for Cordelia, who had loved them. She wept for her grandmother, who had been so afraid of a free woman that she had tried to bury her. She wept for her father, who had carried the secret for 20 years. She wept for her mother, who had never known. When she stopped weeping, she put the journal back on the shelf. She walked out of the library. The amber light in the corridor was waiting. She crossed the corridor to the door marked Assay. She opened it. The assay room was smaller, square, 20 feet on a side. The walls were lined with steel, heavy, industrial, riveted. Steel installed when steel was meant to be permanent. In the center of the room sat 3 squat black safes, cast iron, each as tall as Marigold's waist, each with a brass dial, each unlocked, each door already standing slightly ajar. She approached the nearest safe. She pulled the door open. A cascade of color, or rather, a cascade of a single color. Gold. Gold. The first safe was packed top to bottom with canvas pouches. The pouches had been stacked carefully. Marigold lifted one. It was heavier than a brick. It rattled softly. She untied the cotton drawstring. She tipped the pouch over a corner of the safe's interior shelf. A stream of gold coins poured out. $20 gold pieces. St. Gaudens, Standing Liberty. Pristine, uncirculated. Each one bright and crisp as if minted yesterday. Each one stamped with a date between 1907 and 1933. Hundreds of them, in one pouch. She counted the pouches, 36 pouches. She moved to the second safe. The second safe was filled with gold bars, stacked like firewood. Each bar was about the size of a paperback novel. Each was stamped with the insignia of the Royal Canadian Mint and dates between 1922 and 1928. Marigold counted 48 bars. She moved to the third safe. The third safe was filled with paper, but not money, or rather, money in a form she had only seen in photographs. Gold certificates, the large size kind printed before 1928, mostly $1,000 bills, some 5,000, a few 10,000, all sealed in modern vacuum-packed plastic, recently, within the last few years, by someone who had cared about preserving them, by her father. She knew it without checking. She turned, she sat down, on the cold steel floor, in front of 3 open safes, surrounded by a fortune that she could not even calculate. Gold, gold, gold. Whiskey money turned into rescue money. Rescue money turned into refuge money. Refuge money turned into seed money. For what? For what? She did not know yet. She would know soon. She stood up. She closed the safes. She did not lock them. Some impulse told her not to. She left the assay room. She crossed to the door marked wireless. She opened it. The wireless room was the smallest of the 4, maybe 12 feet square. The walls were paneled in dark cedar. The ceiling had been mounted with a small chandelier of brass and ship's lanterns. Along the longest wall ran a vintage ham radio setup, something a wealthy boy in 1930 would have begged his father for. Glowing brass dials, burled walnut casework, vacuum tubes the size of pickle jars. The wireless rig was beautifully preserved, polished, recently used. On a small writing desk in front of the rig sat a steel lockbox, modern, not antique, maybe 10 years old at most. On top of the lockbox, a sealed envelope with her name on it, in her father's handwriting, his old handwriting, before the Parkinson's, before the medications. Strong, steady, Marigold. She sat down at the desk. She picked up the envelope. She turned it in her hands. She held it for a long time. She did not want to open it. Because once she opened it, her father would be gone in a way he was not gone yet. Right now, there was still one more letter, one more conversation, one more word from him she had not heard. Once she read it, there would be no more. Ever. She opened it. The letter was 4 pages long. Lined paper. Black ink. She began to read. My Marigold. If you are reading this letter, then I am dead, and the lighthouse has come into your hands, as I prayed it would. I have wanted to tell you everything for the last 20 years. I have wanted to tell you the night you turned 8 and asked me why your great-grandmother had been excluded from the family album. I have wanted to tell you the day you wrote your high school history paper on prohibition and chose to write about the law rather than the women. I have wanted to tell you 100 times. I could not, because the secret was not mine to give while I was alive. Because there are people who would have killed for it. Because there are people who tried. Let me tell you now what I know. The Hollister women have run that lighthouse for 98 years. My grandmother Cordelia built it as a station of the Underground Railroad for battered wives. She used her rum money to buy the deed in 1925. She used the cellars she had carved into the cliff in the years before Prohibition to hide women who had nowhere else to go. The Doyles who lived in the keeper's cottage were her partners. Albert Doyle was a Methodist preacher who had lost his wife to a brutal husband he could not stop. He spent the rest of his life helping Cordelia move other men's wives out of harm's way. Henrietta is Albert's daughter-in-law. She does not know what is in the chambers, but she knows there is something, and she has loved your family for it without asking. After Cordelia died in 1962, my own mother, your grandmother, was so ashamed of Cordelia's bootlegging that she sealed the lighthouse and never spoke of it again. She did not understand what her grandmother had truly done. She thought Cordelia was a criminal. She did not see the 812 names in the journals. I found those journals when I was 26 years old. I sat in that library and I read them for 3 days. I came out a different man. I spent the next 30 years quietly maintaining the chambers. I paid the taxes. I patched the roof. I oiled the locks. I waited. I did not know who I was waiting for. Then you were born, and I knew. And I made a promise that someday when you were grown, I would bring you here, and I would put you in front of the wall of names, and I would say to you, my girl, this is what your family did. This is who you come from. Not a string of polite businessmen who restored furniture. A line of women who saved other women when nobody else would. I am sorry I did not get to do it in person. I am sorrier still for what I am about to tell you next. Marigold turned the page. About Yvonne. I knew within 4 months of marrying her that something was wrong. Her stories did not line up. Her face did things at the wrong moments. She would mention people from a city she claimed never to have visited. I hired a private investigator named Bram Tilden out of Seattle. He spent 18 months on her. What he found? Marigold. Sit down before you read the next paragraph. If you are not already sitting, please sit. Yvonne Caldwell is not her real name. Her real name is Yvette Carmody. She was born in Spokane in 1977. She has been married 3 times before me. Each husband died within 5 years of the wedding. Each death was certified as natural causes by her brother, a licensed physician named Roderick Carmody. Roderick lost his medical license in Oregon in 2009, but maintains a small private practice in Idaho where he signs the death certificates for his sister's husbands. Marigold. She was Eleanor's private nurse during the last 6 months of your mother's illness. She had a different name then. She wore her hair differently. She was thinner. She has had 2 cosmetic surgeries since then. But I recognized her 3 months into our marriage. By the way she stirred her coffee. By a small habit of touching her left earring when she lied. By the smell of the soap she used. By 1,000 tiny things a man's body remembers about a woman who came into his house and took care of his dying wife. I think she chose me deliberately. I think she remembered me. I think she saw a widower with a daughter and money, and she came back for the rest of what she had not been able to take the first time. Eleanor did not die of cancer alone. Eleanor was poisoned. I cannot prove the first one. The records were lost. The hospital is gone. The doctors retired. The agent was a slow-acting metal toxin, and it had cleared her system before she died. But Bram Tilden tracked down a lock of her hair that I had kept in a locket. The lab in Seattle ran a heavy metals analysis on the hair shaft. The signature is unmistakable. The dose was administered slowly, over months, through her food, by the person who fed her, by Yvette Carmody, whose name is now Yvonne Caldwell. Marigold could not see the page. The page was a blur. She put the letter down. She put her hands flat on the desk. She breathed. In, out, like someone had once taught her in a meditation class. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She picked the letter back up. I did not divorce her. I could not. If I had divorced her, she would have walked away with what she could grab, and she would have done it again to another widower. I knew her now. I had her name. I had her brother's name. I had 18 months of surveillance. I had a forensic analysis of a lock of your mother's hair, but none of it was enough to convict her of murder. The poison was untraceable to her hand. The cancer cover story had been signed off on by 3 doctors. The hospital had burned in 2009. So I made a different plan. I let her think she had won. I started giving her access to the Hollister Antiques accounts. Slowly. I let her assume control. I watched her embezzle. I watched her route money through Cayman accounts in Sterling's name. I watched her brother Roderick visit twice a year and consult on Eleanor's old medical files, which I kept in the office safe and which I knew she had been photographing for almost 2 years. While she stole, I moved. I have liquidated every cent of the truly valuable Hollister assets and brought them here. The antique shop is a shell. The lakefront property is mortgaged to the gills against loans I took out and routed offshore. The investment portfolio is composed almost entirely of leveraged positions in companies on the brink of insolvency. The vintage cars are leased, not owned. The art is good copies. The originals are in the assay room. The mansion she just inherited is worthless. The businesses she just inherited are bankrupt. The portfolio she just inherited owes the IRS roughly $9 million in back taxes that I deferred over the last 3 years, specifically to position those obligations to mature 6 weeks after my death. She thinks she walked away with $11 million. She walked away with a debt bomb. Inside the lockbox on this desk, you will find a flash drive. It contains every forensic record of her embezzlement, every Cayman wire, every photograph she took of the medical files, every email between her and Roderick, every wire from Roderick's Idaho clinic to a numbered Swiss account. It is enough to convict them both of multiple felonies. It is not enough to convict her of Eleanor's murder. You may not be able to get her for that, my girl. I am sorry. But you can get her for what she did to me, to us, to the Hollister name. And while she is in prison, she will not be able to do it to another family. That is the most I have been able to give you. I love you, Marigold. I love you with every cell of my body that is failing. You are the best thing your mother and I ever made. You are stronger than you know. The light is yours. Turn it on. Dad? Marigold sat at the desk. For a long time, the amber bulbs hummed softly. The Pacific moved somewhere overhead, but she could no longer hear it. The walls of the chamber were too thick. The silence was complete. She thought of her mother. She thought of her mother's last months, the chemo wig, the way her mother had sat up in bed and reached for her 7-year-old daughter and tried to comfort her even when the disease was making her so tired she could barely speak. Her mother had been kind to the very end. Her mother had been gentle. Her mother had been 41 years old. Her mother had been 41 years old. And someone had been feeding her poison for the last 6 months, while telling Marigold's father that the cancer was advancing. Marigold opened the lockbox. Inside, a USB drive, black, unmarked, a small manila envelope. Inside the envelope, a single photograph. A woman in nurse's scrubs leaning over a hospital bed, smiling, holding a spoon. The patient in the bed was Eleanor, pale, wasted, smiling weakly back at the nurse who was about to feed her something. The face of the nurse, younger, thinner, different hair, different glasses. But the eyes, the same eyes, Yvette Carmody, Marigold's stepmother, her mother's killer. Marigold put the photograph back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in the lockbox. She closed the lockbox. She stood up. She did not cry. The crying had passed. The crying had ended in the library. What she felt now was something different, something cold, something steady, something her father had named in the last line of his letter without realizing he was naming it. Stronger than you know. She picked up the lockbox. She tucked it under her arm. She left the wireless room. She walked across the granite corridor. She stopped in front of the door marked Eleanor. She put her hand on the iron handle. She closed her eyes. She thought, "Mom, I am ready now." She opened the door. The room was small. It was the smallest of the four, but it was the most beautiful. The walls had been finished, not raw granite, pine paneling, painted a soft cream color, a small Persian rug on the floor, a reading chair upholstered in faded yellow chintz, a writing desk under a brass lamp, a small bookshelf with perhaps 30 books, a radio receiver from the 1940s, a small porcelain vase on the desk with dried lavender in it, the same lavender she had smelled at the vault door, and on every wall, photographs. Eleanor as a baby, Eleanor as a toddler in a sundress, Eleanor on her first day of school, Eleanor at 12 standing on a beach holding a starfish, Eleanor at 16 in a high school choir robe, Eleanor at 22 in a wedding dress holding Edmund's hand, Eleanor at 31 cradling a newborn marigold, Eleanor at 40 in a garden laughing. The walls were full of her mother. Marigold had not seen most of these photographs in her life. Her father had built a room for her, a room with her mother in it, so that when Marigold finally came down here, she would not just find evidence of her mother's death, she would find evidence of her mother's life. Marigold sat in the yellow chintz chair. On the small writing desk in front of her sat a leather-bound journal, Eleanor's diary. Marigold recognized the handwriting on the cover from old birthday cards. She picked it up. She opened it. The first entry was dated May 4th, 1998, a year before Marigold was born. Beside the diary, a small tape recorder, a cassette already loaded, a note in her father's handwriting taped to the recorder. "Play me first, before you read." Marigold pressed play. A small hiss, a breath, a familiar voice. Tired, but warm. So warm. The voice that had once sung Marigold to sleep with a song about a lighthouse that nobody ever told her was a real lighthouse. The voice said, "My Marigold, if you are listening to this, my love, it is because your father has decided you are old enough to know me again. I am sorry it has been so long. I am sorry I could not stay. I want you to know that I tried. I tried very hard. I did not want to leave you. I want you to know that more than anything else in the world. Your father is going to tell you things now that will be hard. About how I got sick, about who was in our house. I want you to know that I knew my girl. Toward the very end, I knew. I could not say, I could not be sure, but I knew. And I want you to know that what happened was not because anyone failed to love me. Your father loved me with his entire body. You loved me with all of your 7-year-old heart. I knew both of those things in the last week of my life as clearly as I have ever known anything. I want you to do something for me, Marigold. I want you to listen to me, my love, and I want you to understand. What happened to me was not yours to carry. It was hers to carry, and it is your father's now to give to the law, but not yours. Your job is to be free. Your job is to grow up, to make work, to love people, to eat strange foods in strange cities, to wear my pendant on your wedding day if you want to name your daughter whatever feels right, to live Marigold, to live so loud and so wide and so unafraid that the woman who took me out of your life will spend her last years in a cell knowing she could not take you. I love you, my girl. I have loved you from the first second they put you in my arms. I love you across this tape and across these years and across whatever else there is. Be brave. Be soft. Be the woman I would have loved to know. Mom. A click. The tape stopped. Marigold sat in the yellow chair. She sat for a long time. She did not weep this time. She had wept enough. What was happening inside her chest now was not weeping. It was something else. Something her mother had named with the last word on the tape. Mom. It was love. A love that does not die because the person dies. A love that gets carried forward in the body of the child who survives. A love that becomes resolve. A love that becomes a steady hand on a brass dial. Marigold stood up. She picked up the lockbox. She picked up the cassette. She picked up the journal. She did not turn off the amber lights. Some part of her did not want to leave this room dark. She left them on, burning quietly, like a vigil, like a beacon. She walked back down the corridor. She closed the vault door behind her. She spun the dial. She heard the tumblers seat themselves. She climbed the 72 stone steps. She emerged into the ground floor of the lighthouse. The hatch creaked back into its frame. She pulled the moth-eaten rug over it again. From above, the hatch was invisible. She walked out the heavy oak door. The Pacific dawn was breaking over Cape Disappointment. The sky to the east was the color of a peach pit, pale orange, streaked with pink. The Pacific was finally calm, glassy, reflecting the colors of the dawn back into the air. Marigold stood on the headland. She held the lockbox against her chest. She did not feel like the same person who had driven up here in a battered Subaru with $100 in her bank account. She felt like a Hollister. She felt like Cordelia's blood. She felt like Eleanor's daughter. She felt like the woman in the family who had been called. Henrietta Doyle appeared at the edge of the gravel path. She wore the yellow rain slicker. She was holding two enamel mugs. Steam rose from both of them. She did not speak. She handed Marigold a mug. Marigold took it. They stood together in the dawn for a long minute. Then Henrietta said, "You went down." Marigold nodded. "You read." Marigold nodded. The old woman's pale tea eyes filled with tears. She did not wipe them. "Albert was my father-in-law," Henrietta said. "He died in 1980. He never told me what was down there. He told my husband. My husband died before he told me. But I knew. I knew there was something. Your father came every month for 20 years, and I never asked. I never asked because Albert had told my husband, and my husband had told me only one thing. Hollister women come back. When they come back, we feed them coffee. When they come back, we do not ask." Henrietta took a slow breath. "You came back." Marigold turned. She faced the lighthouse. The broken tower, the cracked windows, the black granite drinking the new sun. She thought of 812 names on shelves below her feet. She thought of her mother in a yellow chintz chair that her father had bought just so it would be there when his daughter sat down. She thought of Yvonne Caldwell and her diamond watch. She thought of Sterling and his smirk. She thought of Roderick Carmody in his Idaho clinic signing his sister's death certificates for a fee. She thought of the lockbox under her arm. She thought of what her mother had said. "Be brave. Be soft. Be the woman I would have loved to know." She finished her coffee. She handed the mug back to Henrietta. She said, "I have to go to Portland." Henrietta nodded. "I have to find a man named Bartholomew Finch." Henrietta nodded again. "And then I have to find the FBI." Henrietta's mouth moved into the smallest, fiercest smile Marigold had ever seen on a 78-year-old face. "Go," Henrietta said. Marigold walked to her Subaru. She set the lockbox on the passenger seat. She set the cassette beside it. She set Eleanor's journal on top of both. She started the engine. She looked once in the rearview mirror. The Raven Scar light stood on the headland, black and broken, patient, waiting. It had waited 98 years. It could wait one more day. She put the Subaru in drive. She drove east into the rising sun. The drive from Cape Disappointment to Portland was 3 hours. Marigold did not stop once. Not for gas, not for coffee, not for the bathroom. She drove with the lockbox on the passenger seat. She drove with her mother's cassette tape on top of it. She drove with both hands on the wheel of the Subaru and her jaw set so tight that by the time she crossed the St. John's Bridge into Portland, her back teeth ached. She did not call Bartholomew Finch. She showed up. Wet hair, mud on her boots, 3 days of sleeping in a lighthouse cottage caked into the lines of her face. A 19-year-old girl with a black canvas bag slung over her shoulder, a bag that weighed 37 pounds. Because inside the bag, 3 gold bars, Royal Canadian Mint, stamped 1924. The receptionist tried to stop her. Marigold walked past. The receptionist stood up. Marigold did not slow down. The receptionist said, "Miss, you cannot." Marigold said, "Watch me." She pushed open the heavy glass doors of Bartholomew Finch's private suite. She walked across the wool carpet. She lifted the canvas bag. She dropped it. On the polished mahogany desk, the desk groaned. Bartholomew Finch looked up from his coffee. His coffee cup rattled in the saucer. His reading glasses slid down his nose. He said, "Marigold." She did not sit. She unzipped the bag. She lifted out the first gold bar. She set it on the leather blotter. The second, she set it beside the first. The third, she set it beside the second. 3 little gleaming rectangles. The amber morning light of his office caught the metal and threw soft yellow reflections onto his ceiling. Bartholomew Finch looked at the gold. He looked at Marigold. He took off his reading glasses. He folded them. He set them down. He said very quietly, "You found it." She said, "I found everything," she said, "including what she did to my mother." His old face went pale. He sat down. He sat down hard. He put one hand over his mouth. He breathed through his fingers. He nodded once. He nodded again. He whispered into his palm, "Your father was afraid." He never said, but he was afraid. Marigold pulled the USB drive out of her jacket pocket. She set it on top of the middle gold bar, like a flag claiming a country. She said, "Tom, I need 3 things." He looked up. "I need a forensic accountant, the best one in the Pacific Northwest." He nodded. "I need a contact at the FBI field office. Someone who specializes in financial crimes against the elderly. Someone who will take a heavy metals hair test seriously." He nodded again. "And I need you to file an emergency petition to put a hold on Yvonne Caldwell's access to my father's estate accounts. Today. This morning. Within the hour." He picked up his phone. He started dialing. He did not ask any more questions, because Bartholomew Finch had been waiting 15 years to make these phone calls. The forensic accountant came in an hour. His name was Wendell Pickering. He was 64 years old. He wore a brown corduroy suit. He chewed unlit pipe tobacco. He had spent 30 years in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division before retiring into private practice. He took one look at the USB drive. He plugged it into a laptop he had pulled from a worn leather satchel. He scrolled through the files for 20 minutes without saying a word. Then he looked up. He said, "Miss Hollister?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Your father was a thorough man." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have not seen documentation this clean in my entire career." He scrolled some more. He said, "Embezzlement, wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering through 3 Cayman shells, false corporate filings, insurance fraud, identity fraud given the name discrepancy on file, and, He looked up over his half glasses. He said, "The brother, the doctor." She said, "Yes." He said, "If the heavy metals report on your mother's hair is accurate, and if we can match it to records of any pharmaceutical purchases or veterinary supplies by Dr. Roderick Carmody during the relevant period." He paused. He said, "Miss Hollister, I have never personally worked a homicide case, but I have read a great many, and what you are describing is not a single homicide." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Your mother is one of 4. She said, "What?" He said, "Sit down. You are going to want to sit down for this." The pattern came together over the next 6 weeks. Marigold did not go back to the Lighthouse. She did not have time. She slept on Bartholomew Finch's office couch for the first week, then in a small studio apartment on Northwest 21st that Wendell Pickering's daughter sublet to her for $400 a month. She ate ramen from a hot plate. She wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation. She spent 11 hours a day inside a small conference room on the 7th floor of the Portland Federal Building. Across the table from her sat Special Agent Imani Westbrook. Imani was 55. She was tall. She wore her hair in a short silver crop. She had spent 28 years in the Bureau, working financial crimes against the elderly. She had a daughter Marigold's age in medical school in Baltimore. She kept a photograph of that daughter on the conference room table turned slightly so Marigold could see it. The photograph helped Marigold trust her. Imani knew that. Imani had been doing this work a long time. Imani spread the files across the table. The files were dated, each one a year, each one a name. Husband 1, Vance Pruitt, Spokane, Washington. Married Yvette Carmody in 1996. Died 11 months later. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrhythmia. Death certificate signed by Dr. Roderick Carmody. Vance Pruitt had been 47 years old. He had been a real estate developer. Yvette had inherited a portfolio worth $2.1 million. Husband 2, Calvin Marsden, Boise, Idaho. Married Yvette Carmody in 2000. Died 14 months later. Cause of death listed as acute pancreatitis with complications. Death certificate signed by Dr. Roderick Carmody. Calvin Marsden had been 53. He had been a heart surgeon. Yvette had inherited a portfolio worth $4.8 million. Then there was Eleanor. Eleanor was not a husband. Eleanor was a hospice patient. A private nursing contract. Eleanor had not been the target. Edmund had been the target. Yvette had wanted to be Eleanor. She had wanted Edmund's life. She had wanted Marigold's bedroom. She had wanted Eleanor's pendant. She had decided in 2005 that the Hollister family had something she wanted, and she had set about removing the obstacle. The toxin had been administered through Eleanor's pureed food during the final 6 months of her cancer treatment. The cancer was real. The cancer would have killed Eleanor eventually, but not in 6 months. The cancer would have killed Eleanor in 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years. In which Marigold would have had her mother. In which Edmund would have had his wife. In which a 41-year-old woman would have had time to teach her 7-year-old daughter how to braid her hair, and how to bake a pie, and how to listen for the difference between a hummingbird and a chickadee at the bird feeder. 3 to 5 years. Stolen. By a woman in nurse's scrubs holding a spoon and smiling. Then she had vanished. She had waited. 9 years. 9 years. She had spent those years studying Edmund Hollister at a distance, letting his grief settle, letting his daughter grow, letting his routines become predictable. Then she had reappeared as Yvonne Caldwell. New hair, new glasses, new face, 2 cosmetic surgeries, new career as a real estate agent, new introduction at an estate sale where she knew Edmund would be appraising furniture. She had married him in 8 months. Husband number 4, Edmund Hollister. Astoria, Oregon. Died of complications of early onset Parkinson's disease. Death certificate signed by Dr. Roderick Carmody as the consulting physician of record. Yvonne had inherited an estate worth on paper $11 million. The estate that Edmund had spent 3 years rotting from the inside. Imani closed the last file. She said, "Miss Hollister, we are going to indict your stepmother and her brother on 4 counts of murder, 2 counts of fraud in the first degree, 18 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of false statements to a federal agency, and a racketeering predicate that we will use to bring the whole thing under federal jurisdiction. That means federal prison." Marigold said. "Good," Imani said. "We are also going to indict her son, Sterling Caldwell." Marigold said. "For what?" Imani said. "Sterling has been on the Cayman account since he was 19. He has signed 17 separate wire instructions in his own hand over a 5-year period. Total volume moved $6.2 million. We have him cold on money laundering and conspiracy." Marigold said. "Did he know?" Imani's eyes met hers. Imani said, Miss Hollister, Sterling is not a child. Sterling is 24. Sterling has access to his mother's safe. Sterling was present at 3 of the meetings with the Cayman attorneys. Sterling has a degree in finance from Lewis and Clark College. He knew. Marigold sat with that for a moment. She thought of Sterling at the funeral. She thought of his smirk. She thought of him winking at her over her father's grave. She said, "Then indict him." Imani nodded. Imani said, "There is one more thing, and this is your decision, not mine." Marigold said, "Tell me." Imani said, "Yvonne is hosting a charity gala at the Lakefront House in 2 weeks, October 28th. 300 guests, state senators, real estate developers, trustees of the Portland Art Museum. $10,000 a plate," Marigold said. "What charity?" Imani's mouth tightened. Imani said, "The official charity is the Pacific Coast Widows Foundation. Yvonne started it in 2019. The board is 2 attorneys and an accountant. None of them work for free. The foundation has reported total charitable disbursements of $14,000 over 6 years. Total funds raised $2.1 million. Marigold did not blink. Marigold said, "She has been laundering money through a fake widow's charity," Imani said. "Yes," Marigold said. "While being a serial widow," Imani said. "Yes," Marigold said. "Arrest her at the gala," Imani said. "Are you sure?" Marigold said. "Make sure every senator in that ballroom sees her in handcuffs," Imani said. "Marigold, that is not how the Bureau usually." Marigold said, "I am the only living member of the Hollister family. I am the daughter of the woman she poisoned. I am the daughter of the man she stole $11 million from. I am the witness on this case. I am asking you to arrest her at her own party in front of everyone she has worked 30 years to impress. I am asking you to do it because I want her to feel for 1 minute, 1 single minute, the way my mother felt when she realized she was being poisoned by the woman who was feeding her." Imani Westbrook held Marigold's eyes for a long time. Then Imani Westbrook said, "Wear something gorgeous." The gala was held on the lawn of the Lake Oswego estate on the last Saturday of October. A massive white tent, 200 yards long, roped off in velvet, strung with thousands of small glass lanterns, heaters tucked along the sides, a string quartet playing Vivaldi at the eastern entrance, a jazz trio playing standards near the bar, hothouse orchids in every centerpiece, 3 open bars, a whole roasted lamb on a copper spit, ice sculptures of swans melting slowly into copper pans, 2 black SUVs parked discreetly behind a hedge of arbutus at the north edge of the property. Inside the SUVs, 6 federal agents, a search warrant for the lakefront residence, a second warrant for the Pacific Coast Widows Foundation business records, a third warrant for Roderick Carmody's clinic in Coeur d'Alene, a fourth warrant for Sterling Caldwell's downtown loft, and, in the trunk, 48 pages of grand jury indictments, already signed, already sealed. Yvonne Caldwell stood in the center of the tent in a column of scarlet silk. A Valentino gown, custom cut, a diamond choker, a diamond bracelet, diamond chandelier earrings. Her hair had been pulled back into a chignon so tight it had to hurt. Her makeup was perfect. Her teeth were perfect. Her smile was perfect. She held a glass of champagne in her left hand. She held a young senator's elbow in her right. She was laughing. She was laughing so prettily. A photographer for the Portland Society pages was capturing her from 3 steps away. She did not see the black Rolls-Royce Phantom turn into the driveway. Sterling saw it. Sterling was standing near the bar with a vodka soda. He was wearing a charcoal Tom Ford tuxedo. He had ordered the vodka soda before he had spoken to a single guest. He was a young man whose phone was always in his hand. He looked up from his phone at the sound of the Rolls-Royce's engine. He frowned. He did not recognize the car. Yvonne had not rented a Rolls-Royce for the gala. A Rolls-Royce had pulled into Yvonne's driveway at the peak of Yvonne's biggest social event of the year. And it was not a guest. Sterling tilted his head. He set the vodka soda down. A uniformed driver got out of the Rolls. He walked around the hood. He opened the rear passenger door. The string quartet faltered. The cellist missed a beat, then another. Then she stopped playing entirely. The jazz trio noticed. They stopped too. Conversation began to drop off in a slow wave outward from the driveway. The guests turned. The senators turned. The trustees of the Portland Art Museum turned. A woman stepped out of the Rolls-Royce. She was 19 years old. She was wearing an emerald green silk gown, floor length, bias cut, off the shoulder. A gown a woman in 1945 would have worn to a state dinner in Washington. A gown that looked like it had been hand-sewn in Paris in 1945 because it had been. Cordelia Hollister had brought it home in a steamer trunk in 1946. It had been folded in tissue paper in the assay room for 79 years. It fit Marigold like it had been waiting for her, around her throat. A 6-carat diamond pendant, Eleanor's pendant, the one Yvonne had spent 6 years tearing the house apart looking for. The one Edmund had quietly removed from the safe 4 months before he died and locked inside the assay room and left on the marble shelf with a small handwritten card that said, "For my Marigold. Wear this in front of her. You will know when." Marigold knew now. The pendant lay against her collarbone like a small piece of trapped sunlight. She had braided her hair, the way her mother used to braid it, a single thick braid over her left shoulder. She wore no other jewelry. She did not need any. Beside her on the gravel, Bartholomew Finch, in a dark blue suit, Wendell Pickering, in his brown corduroy, and in dark windbreakers with gold badges visible on their belts. Special Agent Imani Westbrook, 3 of her colleagues, 2 Oregon State police officers, a photographer from the Oregonian, a journalist from the Willamette Week, a camera operator from KGW Channel 8 News. Marigold walked toward the tent. Her satin heels crunched on the gravel. She did not hurry. She did not slow. She walked like women in old movies walked when they had something to say and 100 years to say it in. Yvonne saw her. Yvonne's smile froze. Yvonne's smile cracked. Yvonne's smile fell off her face the way cheap plaster falls off a wall. She let go of the senator's arm. She stood very still in her column of scarlet silk. She said, "Security." She said it quietly. A young man in a black blazer stepped forward. Then he saw the badges. He stepped back. Yvonne said, "Marigold, Monsieur Barigon." Marigold did not answer. Yvonne said louder, "Marigold, this is a private function. You are trespassing." Marigold said, "Hello, Yvette." Yvonne's face went the color of bone. The senator she had been holding 3 minutes ago took 2 long steps backward. The photographer for the Portland Society pages began clicking. Frame after frame. She had been at galas for 15 years. She knew what she was seeing. She did not yet know how big it was, but she was going to make sure she had the photographs. Yvonne said, "Marigold, whoever you think," Marigold said. "Yvette Carmody, born Spokane, May 17, 1977, sister of Dr. Roderick Carmody, hospice nurse to Eleanor Hollister, January through July 2005, widow of Vance Pruitt, widow of Calvin Marsden, wife to Edmund Hollister at the time of his death." The crowd was silent. 300 people. Silent, Yvonne said. "This is absurd," Marigold said. "Sterling, are you over by the bar still?" Sterling did not answer. He had begun edging slowly toward the back of the tent. A state trooper detached from the group around Marigold and walked unhurriedly across the lawn to where Sterling was edging. The trooper said nothing. The trooper simply stood beside Sterling. Sterling stopped edging. Marigold said, "Yvette, Did you really believe Edmund did not know? Yvonne said. I do not know what you are. Do not he, Marigold said. He recognized you within 4 months. He hired Bram Tilden out of Seattle. 18 months of surveillance. A laboratory in Seattle ran a heavy metals analysis on a lock of my mother's hair my father kept in a locket. He found the signature Yvette. He found Roderick's prescriptions. He found the wires from Coeur d'Alene to your Cayman accounts. He found Vance Pruitt. He found Calvin Marsden. He found everything. Yvonne's mouth opened. Yvonne's mouth closed. Marigold said, and while you were stealing $6 million from the Hollister antique shop, he was liquidating the rest, quietly, steadily, for 3 years. You inherited a Shell Yvette. The shop is bankrupt. The lakefront house is mortgaged at 130% of value. The investment portfolio owes the IRS $9 million in deferred capital gains taxes that came due last Friday. The vintage cars are leased. The art is reproductions. She paused. She said, the $11 million you stole was $11 million of debt. Yvonne's lips moved. No sound came out. Marigold said, the mansion you are standing in, Yvette, is in pre-foreclosure. The bank has already filed. A small, strange, inhuman sound came from Yvonne's throat. A sound a woman makes when she realizes the floor has been pulled out from under her not by an enemy, but by a husband who let her hold the rope while he sawed it. Marigold stepped closer, she said. And one last thing, Yvette. Yvonne's eyes had become small, hot, animal. Marigold said, we found the locker in Coeur d'Alene where your brother kept the records. We have the prescriptions. We have the lab reports. We have his ledger. Every dose, every date, every patient, including Vance Pruitt, including Calvin Marsden, including my mother. She paused. She said, did you keep the spoon? Yvonne broke. Yvonne lunged, her right hand, heavy with diamonds, came up. It did not connect. Amani Westbrook caught Yvonne's wrist in midair, twisted it behind Yvonne's back, drove Yvonne forward onto her stomach onto the cold November grass. The diamond bracelet broke. Tiny stones scattered across the lawn. The diamond chandelier earrings caught in Yvonne's hair. The chignon came undone. Yvonne's hair fell around her face in a tangle. Yvonne began to scream. She screamed obscenities. She screamed names. She screamed things at Marigold that Marigold did not hear because Marigold had stopped listening. Marigold was already turning, already walking past the senator, past the Portland Society photographer who was now openly weeping while still taking photographs, past the dropped champagne flutes, past the ice swans. The state trooper handcuffed Sterling Caldwell. Sterling said nothing. Sterling looked finally like a 24-year-old boy. A boy who had spent his entire adult life being his mother's accomplice. A boy who was about to spend most of his 30s and 40s in federal prison. He looked at Marigold. He did not smirk. He looked away. Marigold did not look at him. 200 miles east in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 8 federal agents walked through the front door of Dr. Roderick Carmody's clinic at exactly the same minute. Dr. Roderick Carmody was eating a tuna melt at his desk. He did not finish the tuna melt. Yvonne Caldwell was arraigned the following Tuesday. She was charged in federal court with 22 counts. She was denied bail. She wore an orange jumpsuit. She had no makeup. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band. Without the makeup, without the diamonds, she looked her age. She looked tired. She looked like a 50-year-old woman who had spent 30 years pretending to be someone else and had finally been caught. Sterling Caldwell pled guilty 4 months later in a deal that recommended 15 years. Roderick Carmody held out until trial. The jury came back in 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Yvonne Caldwell to 30 years without possibility of parole. The judge sentenced Roderick Carmody to 25. Sterling got 14. Marigold sat in the front row of the gallery on the day of Yvonne's sentencing. She wore a black wool dress. She wore her mother's pendant. When the judge read the sentence, Yvonne turned. Slowly, she looked across the courtroom. She found Marigold's eyes. Marigold did not look away. She simply looked. The way her mother used to look at the moon out of the kitchen window in October, with a kind of quiet wonder that an old enemy was finally being put away forever. Yvonne looked away first. Marigold left the courtroom. She walked out into the gray Portland afternoon. The rain was beginning. The same kind of rain that had fallen at her father's funeral. The same rain that had fallen on the day she had signed away her inheritance. This time, the rain did not bite. This time, she walked through it slowly. Henrietta Doyle was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. She held a thermos. She held two enamel mugs. She did not speak. She poured. They stood together, under a black umbrella, sipping cardamom coffee, watching the rain make small dark circles on the marble steps. After a while, Henrietta said, "What now?" Marigold said, "Now I light the lamp." A year passed. The Ravenscar light station was extensively restored. Marigold did not use the gold. Not for the lighthouse, not for herself. She did not sell a single ounce of Cordelia's bullion. She did not auction a single bottle of Prohibition whiskey. She did not move a single gold certificate. She left the assay room exactly as her father had left it. Instead, she did something else. She petitioned the state of Oregon to remove the Ravenscar property from the structural hazard demolition list. She filed for nonprofit incorporation papers in February. She raised $3 million by April, some from a Hollister Antiques liquidation auction once the federal seizures were unwound, some from estate insurance proceeds that turned out to be in Marigold's name after all, because Edmund had been 3 steps ahead on the policies, some from individual donors who read about the case in the Oregonian and wrote checks unprompted. One check came in from Spokane, from a daughter of Vance Pruitt who had been 12 when her father died and who had grown up suspecting. The check was for $200, with a note that said, "Use this however you need to. Thank you for getting her." Marigold framed the note. She hung it in the new offices. The new offices were on the second floor of the keeper's cottage at Cape Disappointment, above the new front parlor, above the new kitchen, down the hall from the new bedroom. Marigold lived there now. She had moved her things in pieces over the summer. Henrietta Doyle lived 3/4 of a mile up the road in the gray cottage with the blue shutters. Henrietta had become the chairwoman of the board of the Hollister Foundation. She wore the yellow rain slicker to every board meeting because Marigold had asked her to. The foundation had 3 programs. The first program was a women's shelter on the upper floors of the keeper's cottage. 5 rooms, 5 beds, a small kitchen on the ground floor, a laundry, a library, 2 staff counselors, 1 staff attorney, 8 women a year, maybe 10. Long-term placements only. Placements where the woman was not just escaping a bad week, but rebuilding an entire life. The foundation paid for new names, new social security numbers, new driver's licenses, first and last month's rent, in new cities, 2 years of community college tuition, and a small monthly stipend that ended only when the woman herself wrote a letter saying she did not need it anymore. The first 3 residents arrived in July. Marigold did not meet them at the door. Marigold did not want them to feel surveilled. The intake counselor met them at the door. Henrietta met them at the door. A woman named Iris, something whose name Marigold did not allow herself to learn until the woman offered it on her own 3 weeks later when she was ready. Iris was the first. Iris was 23. Iris had walked into a county courthouse in Lewis County with a fractured cheekbone and asked for help. The clerk had quietly handed her a folded piece of paper with the foundation's phone number on it. Iris had called from a payphone outside a Greyhound station. The intake counselor had picked her up 4 hours later. Iris cried for the first 2 days. Iris ate 4 meals on the 3rd day. Iris asked on the 5th day if she could take a walk to the lighthouse. Marigold met her by accident at the base of the tower. Iris was looking up at the broken upper third. Iris said, "It looks like a tooth," Marigold said. "It does," Iris said. "Are you the one?" Marigold said. "Yes," Iris said. "Why?" Marigold thought about the question for a long time. Marigold said, "Because someone in my family did this for women 100 years ago, and then somebody made everyone forget, and I am not going to let them forget anymore." Iris said, "That is a long memory." Marigold said, "It is." The second program was the library. Marigold had spent 5 months talking to historians, archivists, the Oregon Historical Society, the University of Washington Press, a small specialty publishing house in Portland that had published a series on women's history in the Pacific Northwest. She had decided finally to do the thing her grandmother had never done. She brought Cordelia out of the cellar. She made copies of the journals, every one, 47 of them under Cordelia's hand, hundreds more under the Doyles. She did not move the originals. The originals stayed in the granite library untouched, preserved at the same temperature and humidity they had been preserved at for 90 years. But the copies were donated to 3 universities and 1 nonprofit archive. The names of the 812 women Cordelia had helped were now searchable in academic databases. Researchers could write to the Foundation for access. 3 doctoral dissertations were already underway. Cordelia Hollister would not be forgotten anymore. The grandmother who had erased her was herself slowly being forgotten. That seemed about right. The third program. The third program was the lamp. The Fresnel lens at the top of the tower had not turned in 83 years. Marigold hired a master craftsman from a Coast Guard restoration program in Maine. He spent 4 months on the lens, cleaning, polishing, restoring the prisms, recasting 2 broken sections of crown glass, repairing the rotation mechanism, rebuilding the brass clockwork that turned the apparatus on its bearings. The lamp itself had originally been an oil lamp. Marigold did not restore the oil mechanism. She did not want fire at the top of an old tower that 19-year-old women would now be living below. She replaced the oil lamp with a modern LED lighting unit, solar-powered, battery-backed, photovoltaic panels on the south slope of the cottage roof. The lens was still the original Fresnel. The light source had just been updated. It was, Marigold thought, the perfect metaphor for what she was trying to do. Keep the lens, change what burned inside it. The lighting ceremony was held on October 29th, a year to the day after the gala. A small crowd gathered on the headland. Bartholomew Finch in a long wool coat, Wendell Pickering in a brown corduroy suit and a heavy wool scarf, Imani Westbrook in a navy blazer, her silver hair catching the wind, Henrietta Doyle in the yellow slicker, 3 Foundation residents who had asked to be present, 2 reporters from regional papers, a photographer from National Geographic who had heard the story and asked to come at her own expense. The sun set at 6:14 p.m. that evening. It set into the Pacific the way it always did on the Oregon coast, slowly, with a great deal of color, as though the world were taking its time about something important. At 6:32 p.m., Marigold climbed the iron staircase of the lighthouse. She climbed alone. She had asked to be alone for this part. 6 floors, 243 iron steps. She had walked them so many times now, she did not need to count. She emerged into the lantern room. The restored Fresnel lens stood at the center, gleaming, patient. 46 tiers of cut crystal, all of them clean, all of them catching the last orange light from the dying sun. She walked to the small control panel that the main craftsman had installed on the eastern wall. She placed her hand on the brass switch. She closed her eyes. She thought of her mother and her father and Cordelia and the 812 names. She thought of Iris and the 2 women who had arrived last week. She thought of Henrietta, who had carried the secret without ever being told what it was for 60 years, because her father-in-law had once asked her to. She thought of every woman who had stood in places like this at the end of long roads in the cold alone, deciding whether she had it in her to do the next thing. She had it in her. She opened her eyes. She pressed the switch. The lens hummed. The motor turned. The LED inside the lamp came alive. A beam of white light shot out of the broken upper third of the tower. It traveled across the gray Pacific. It traveled across the green headland. It traveled across the gravel path. It touched the heads of the small crowd gathered below. It rotated, slowly, patient, a long white beam reaching out across the dark. The crowd below, when she looked down through the broken windows, was not cheering. They were just standing, quietly, watching the light. Henrietta had her hands folded in front of her. Imani had taken off her glasses to wipe her eyes. Iris was looking up at the beam with her mouth slightly open, the way a person looks at something she did not know was possible. Marigold stood in the lantern room, wind through the broken panes, the Pacific dark below, the light turning above her. Mom, she thought, I lit it. She walked down the iron staircase. She walked back across the gravel path. She walked into the keeper's cottage where her people were waiting. They had a small meal, soup, brown bread, a coffee with cardamom that Henrietta had brewed in a battered enamel pot. They talked quietly. Imani told a long story about her daughter's medical school internship. Wendell told a long story about the first IRS case he had ever worked. Bartholomew told a long story about a fishing trip with Edmund in 1984. Marigold mostly listened. After a while, when the kitchen had grown warm with bread steam and bodies, she stood up. She walked out the cottage door. She walked the gravel path back to the base of the lighthouse. She did not enter the tower. She just stood at the base. She looked up. The light turned. Every 12 seconds. A long white beam reaching out, then sweeping home. Out and home. Out and home. The Pacific below was black. The sky above was a cold high blue dusted with stars. Cape Disappointment in late October smelled like salt and wood smoke and pine. She felt for the first time since her father had died that the next chapter of her life was not something she had to drag herself through. It was something she had built. A door opened behind her. Henrietta came out, the yellow slicker over her shoulders against the cold. The old woman walked up beside Marigold. She did not speak. She did not need to. After a while, Henrietta said, "Your great-grandmother would have liked you, Hollister girl." Marigold said, "I would have liked her too." The light turned. The light reached. The light kept turning. The two women stood on the headland of Cape Disappointment. A year and 4 days after a stepmother had laughed in a polished mahogany office and told her to have fun in the salt air. Marigold Hollister, 19 years old at the start of this story, 20 years old, now stood on the cold edge of the American Pacific, looking at a light she had brought back from the dead. She was not alone. She had never been alone. She had been carried all this time by a long chain of women, reaching back Cordelia, June, Henrietta, Eleanor, and now her. She was the next one. She would not be the last one. Tomorrow there was more work. She turned. She walked back across the gravel. She went into the cottage. She closed the door behind her. Behind her on the cliff, the lighthouse kept turning. For the first time in 83 years, the Raven Scar light was burning, and it would not go out again.